All right, we ready to begin with Zechariah 7? All right, let's do it. Okay, so again, this is a question of fasting that gets brought up to Zechariah. So, again, the first 6 chapters, all one night. And then now, if you look at the dating from chapter 1, and then you look at the dating here in chapter 7, we are 2 years later, about 2 years later in time. So, the 8 night visions would have occurred in 520 BC. This time in this vision is going to be 518. 518. So it's halfway through since Zerubbabel and them restarted the whole building of the temple compound again. So remember, they started in 536 when they got back from the decree of Cyrus, and they were ordered to stop. Haggai and Zechariah encouraged them, and now it's okay. We started rebuilding, so they're 2 years in, 2 years to go, before they complete it. As far as completing it, let's look at Ezra chapter 6. So in chapter 6, verse 15. Actually, we'll start verse 14 just because of the mention of Haggai and Zechariah. And the elders of the Jews were successful in building through the prophesying of Haggai the prophet and Zechariah the son of Iddo. And they finished building according to the command of the God of Israel in the decree of Cyrus, Darius, and Artaxerxes, king of Persia. This temple was completed on the 3rd day of the month Adar, and it was the 6th year of the reign of King Darius. So 6th year, when they had to put a stop to it, it was earlier. But that's when it'll get completed in 516 BC. Right now we're 518, so we're halfway there. Halfway there. So in chapter 7, notice in Ezra it said 6th year, it's completed. Chapter 7, verse 1 of Zechariah, in the 4th year of King Darius. So this is kind of how we can do the calendar thing. And then I think the very first handout it gave you with the timeline should have all of those dates and things in there. So we'll start with the question on the fasting, which is going to be verses 1 through 7 of Zechariah chapter 7. So in the 4th year of King Darius, the word of the Lord came to Zechariah on the 4th day of the 9th month, which is Kislev. Now the town of Bethel had sent Sharezer and Regemelech and their men to seek the favor of the Lord, speaking to the priests who belonged to the house of the Lord of hosts, and to the prophets, saying, Shall I weep in the 5th month and abstain as I have done these many years? Then the word of the Lord of hosts came to me, saying, Say to all the people of the land and to the priests, when you fasted and mourned in the 5th and 7th months these 70 years, was it actually for me that you fasted? When you eat and drink, do you not eat for yourselves, and do you not drink for yourselves? Are not these the words which the Lord proclaimed by the former prophets, when Jerusalem was inhabited and prosperous, along with the cities around it, and the Negev, or the south country, and the foothills, and this would be the Shephelah, so a bit south of Jerusalem, were inhabited? So we've got a group of people that are coming from the north down into Jerusalem to ask after the prophets about this question of fasting. Question of fasting. What's interesting about these guys, Sharezer and Regemelech, these are not Hebraic names. One's an Assyrian name, one's a Babylonian name. And Sharezer means either protect the king or prince of fire. And Regemelech means friend of the king or the king's companion. So, and I'll backtrack up again to verse 1. So again, the 4th year of King Darius. So again, this is Darius Hystaspes, and going back to the night visions where, he shuts down all the pretenders to the throne and, the empire is at ease, basically. So the word of the Lord came to Zechariah on the 4th day of the 9th month. So when you're thinking of, again, the months, here it says Kislev. So Kislev would be November, December area. Um, so the town of Bethel, this one is interesting because if you guys remember when the split happened with Jeroboam and Rehoboam, Jeroboam sets up two false centers of religious idolatry. One is in Dan, way up to the north, and one is in Bethel, which is closer to Jerusalem, because he doesn't want the 10 northern tribes to think, hey, we're worshiping God in the wrong place, so I don't want you going back to Jerusalem. I want you staying here. And I'm going to make my own priesthood, and I'm going to make my own feast days, and he sets up this idolatrous system. And then Bethel, as part of the 10 northern kingdoms, they get taken in the Assyrian captivity. Bethel is destroyed. We also find out elsewhere in Ezra and Nehemiah that when exiles returned, they rebuilt the town after it was destroyed a couple hundred years earlier. Now, why this is interesting is, again, remember, this was a center of idolatry for how long? Few hundred years, and then there was no town. The whole place was wrecked. Like if you look up online today, a place called Tel Dan, Tel basically means like hill or archaeological dig. Dan, you can actually see that temple that Jeroboam had built up there, the ruins of it anyway, as in the idolatry place. But now this time it's pretty clear if they're going to Jerusalem and they're going to seek the prophets, they've decided to reject that false idolatrous system that Jeroboam had set up. But, they were obviously born in the captivity because, again, they don't have Hebraic names. It's Assyrian and Babylonian names. So the town of Bethel, so they are going to send these two emissaries, Sharezer, Regamelech, and their men. So it's kind of like, their escort, so to speak. Most likely guards and things, because, again, you probably still had roving bandits, wild animals, all that kind of stuff to contend with. So they're going to seek the favor of the Lord. So again, Yahweh, not the golden calf stuff that Jeroboam had set up. And then speaking to the priests who belong to the house of the Lord of hosts, and to the prophets, saying, shall I weep in the 5th month and abstain as I have done these many years? In verse 3. So on the calendar thing, the 5th month is the month of Av. I've got it spelled AB on here, AV. AB, the BV sound would be about the same in Hebrew. So when we say Tisha B'Av, that would roughly correspond to the 9th of the month of Av. What this fast is about is when the first temple fell in 586 BC to Nebuchadnezzar. So the first temple is going to fall then. But Tisha B'Av has quite a storied history in terms of a day of tragedy for the Jews, and it's still remembered to this day. National Israel even today still will remember this. So the first temple fell to Nebuchadnezzar in 586 BC. The second temple, under the Roman general Titus, is going to get destroyed the exact same day, 70 AD. Other events, and there's a lot, so I'm only going to hit a few, but Queen Isabella and King Ferdinand of Spain issue the Spanish Inquisition against the Jews the same exact day, called the whole conversos thing, forced conversion, that kind of stuff. And if you don't convert, we kill you, we take your stuff, that kind of thing. The Kristallnacht under Adolf Hitler, and the others were to force the Jews into the ghettos and put the same day, Tisha B'Av. And there's other events throughout their history that have happened on the exact same day. this pattern that repeats. And from that, they still, like I said, fast and remember it. But again, the question is about fasting. So my question, when I think of for the group, how many fasts did God command? Not fast people observed, but how many do you think God commanded? I'll give you a hint. It's between 0 and 2. One. One fast. Yom Kippur, the Day of Atonement. That is the only time God actually commanded national Israel, rich, poor, no matter where you are, everybody fasts that day. Yom Kippur. It's the only one that is commanded. So they're asking a question here, as we have done these many years. Should we keep doing it? That's their major question. So this is something they undertook on their own. And like I said, this continues all the way to this day. And so they want to know, what does God think about this? Should we keep doing it? So Zechariah's response when the word of the Lord comes to him, verses 4 through 7, then the word of the Lord of the hosts came to me, saying, say to all the people of the land and to the priests, when you fasted and mourned in the 5th and 7th months, and I'll get back to that one, these 70 years, was it actually for me that you fasted? So what's going on here, it's a rhetorical question. Have you done this for me? Even me? Did you really do this for me? That's the point of God's question. In other words, okay, sure, you fasted, but was it for me, or was it just because the temple was destroyed? A piece of real estate. Remember, in Ezekiel's time, the Shekinah glory had left. The visible presence of the Holy Spirit in there was gone by the time this thing gets destroyed. And then God's asking, was it even for me you did this? Or was it for your own desires, your religious works, as it will? Verse 6, when you eat and drink, do you not do it for yourselves? And do you not drink for yourselves? Eat or drink? Are not these the words which the Lord had commanded through the former prophets? So the former prophets, these would be the pre-exile ones. So, Isaiah, Hosea, Amos, for example, Micah, Zephaniah, a lot of the others. You could even include Jeremiah and Ezekiel to some extent in there. But remember, they prophesied during the Babylonian captivity as well and after. Daniel is largely during the exile, past all of this. The current prophets right now would be Haggai and Zechariah. Malachi has not really shown up on the scene yet. He's going to be later. So was it even for them that you did this? And now God's going to introduce a second fast in verse 5 that they have observed, and that's the 7th month. The 7th month is in honor of the assassination of Gedaliah. And then for that, let's turn back to Jeremiah chapter 41. Jeremiah chapter 41. And we'll just take a look at the first 3 verses of Jeremiah 41. So in the 7th month, Ishmael, the son of Nethaniah, the son of Elishama of the royal family, and one of the chief officers of the king, along with 10 men, came to Mizpah, and Gedaliah, the son of Ahikam, while they were eating bread together there in Mizpah. Ishmael, the son of Nethaniah, and the 10 men who were with him arose and struck down Gedaliah, the son of Ahikam, the son of Shaphan, with the sword, and put to death the one whom the king of Babylon had appointed over the land. Ishmael also struck down all the Jews who were with him, that is, with Gedaliah at Mizpah, and the Chaldeans who were found there, the men of war. So what this fast is about is the assassination of Gedaliah. he was the appointed governor over the land, so they don't have any king. And if you read earlier in Jeremiah, Gedaliah actually starts doing some good things, but others aren't having it. So they put together an assassination plot, kill him, and then things get worse. And then Jeremiah, like some of the remaining leaders, they decide later on, they want to go to Egypt because things were better when we sacrificed to the Queen of Heaven. And they essentially force/kidnap, take Jeremiah down to Egypt with them. So that's the fast of the 7th month in Zechariah. But before we move back there, as far as like the point of the fasting and such from the former prophets, we could backtrack from Jeremiah to Isaiah chapter 58, please. Isaiah chapter 58. So we'll pick it up in starting in verse 3. So in verse 3 of Isaiah 58, it starts off, "Why have we fasted and you do not see? Why have we humbled ourselves and you do not notice? Behold, on the day of your fast, find your desire. Drive hard all your workers. Behold, you fast for contention and strife, and to strike with a wicked fist. You do not fast like you do today to make your voice heard on high. Is it a fast like this which I choose? A day for a man to humble himself? Is it for bowing one's head like a reed and for spreading out sackcloth and ashes as a bed? Will you call this a fast, even an acceptable day to the Lord? Is this not the fast which I choose, to loosen the bonds of wickedness, to undo the bands of the yoke, to let the oppressed go free, and break every yoke? Is it not to divide your bread with the hungry, and to bring the homeless poor into the house? When you see the naked, to cover him, not to hide himself, or not to hide yourself from your own flesh?" So when you see these verses, notice it starts off, your desire, make your voice heard, contention, strife. You're doing this for your own desires, your own wants, your own means. But at the end of it, verse 6 and 7, God's saying, shouldn't you just loosen the bonds of the wicked? Shouldn't you undo the yoke and the bands of the oppressors? Shouldn't you share your food with the hungry? Shouldn't you bring the poor into the house so they're not out in the wild? Shouldn't you provide clothing? In other words, shouldn't you be doing all this good stuff, but instead you're contending, you're fighting, you're striving, you're arguing, all this stuff. And, God's rhetorically asking in Zechariah 7, are you doing this for me? Much like Isaiah, one of the former prophets here that he mentions earlier in the verses. Or are you just doing this for yourself? Is it just a religious show? Or is it a way that you can essentially say, well, look at me. I'm fasting this day. You're not. I'm better than you. And strife and contention happens. When you eat and drink, do you not eat for yourselves? Do you not drink for yourselves? Are not these the words which the Lord proclaimed by the former prophets, when Jerusalem was inhabited and prosperous, along with the cities around it, and the Negev and the foothills were inhabited? So notice that in the time of the former prophets, before the exile happened, they had the good life. The agriculture was there. The foothills, the population was there, and sustenance was there. Now, after the siege, you have only a small remnant that has come back. A whole bunch of them had stayed in Babylon because they're like, yeah, we like it better here. You think back to even at the time of the Exodus. Oh, we wish we were back in Egypt. We had all the leeks and the onions and the meat and this and that and the other thing. Now all we've got is this manna. Complaining and the like. You can kind of see these patterns. And in God saying, when you had the good life, under the former prophets, your forefathers, what do? Well, they just did it for themselves. What are you guys doing? Remember, the Lord, He can see the heart. The Lord knows the thoughts and the intentions of the heart. We as people, we can look on an outward display of religiosity, but what are these people doing it for? Not to pick on the Catholics, but Ash Wednesday was the previous month. How many of them really were honoring the Lord, or just showing up just to get the ashes put on the forehead, and then we'll go to the grocery store. Look at me, I'm a good Catholic. I went in and I got this, and then there's no real change or belief. Like I said, I'm not trying to paint all Catholics with the same broad brush, but I'm sure there's a fair amount of them where it's, well, this is just what we do. This is what we've always done. This is what my parents taught me. This is, it's just either a cultural or ritualistic thing that they would do. Much like maybe with this. Oh, it's the 9th of Av. Well, now it's fast day today. All right. Should we keep doing it? And again, like I mentioned before, there's only one that was commanded, Yom Kippur, the Day of Atonement. This one is essentially a man-made tradition, much like Ash Wednesday, a man-made tradition. It is what it is. So now God's going to further respond to them in the next portion of Zechariah chapter 7. Starting in verse 8. Then the word of the Lord came to Zechariah, saying, Thus has the Lord of hosts said, dispense true justice, practice kindness and compassion, each to his brother. Doesn't that sound an awful lot like what we just read in Isaiah towards the end? Verse 10, do not oppress the widow or the orphan, the stranger or the poor, and do not devise evil in your hearts against one another. But they refused to pay attention and turned a stubborn shoulder, stopped their ears from hearing. They made their hearts like flint, so that they could not hear the word of the law and the words which the Lord of hosts had sent by his Spirit through the former prophets. Therefore a great wrath came from the Lord of hosts. Just as he called, and they would not listen, so they called, and I would not listen, said the Lord of hosts. But I scattered them with a storm wind among all the nations whom they have not known. Thus the land is desolated behind them, so that no one went back and forth, for they made the pleasant land desolate. So, it doesn't sound like God's actually answering the question about the fasts yet, right? He wants to make a point to them first before he actually answers the question about the fasting. So in verse 8, again, the word of the Lord comes to Zechariah. Thus the Lord of hosts said. So he's saying, okay, you doing this, but are you neglecting these things? Dispense true justice, practice kindness and compassion, each to his brother. Let's backtrack to another one of the former prophets, a few books back to the book of Micah. Micah chapter 6. So in Micah chapter 6, and again, Micah is a pre-exile prophet. We'll look at verses 6 through 8. 6 through 8. He's going to say something very similar to what Zechariah has said, what Isaiah had said. So picking up in verse 6 of chapter 6. With what shall I come to the Lord and bow myself before the God on high? Shall I come to him with burnt offerings, with yearling calves? Does the Lord take delight in thousands of rams and 10,000 rivers of oil? Shall I present my firstborn for my rebellious acts, the fruit of my body for the sin of my soul? He has told you, O man, what is good. And what does the Lord require of you? But to do justice, to love kindness, and to walk humbly with your God. Do justice, love kindness, walk humbly with your God. Zechariah 7 verse 9. dispense true justice, practice kindness, compassion each to his brother. Implicit in all that is walk humbly with your God. Walk humbly with your God. And then in verse 10, and do not oppress the widow or the orphan, the stranger, or the poor. Do not devise evil in your hearts against one another. So again, this is all that, love the Lord your God with all your heart, soul, and mind, strength. Love your neighbor as yourself. The two greatest commandments of the law. Do not oppress the widow or the orphan, the stranger or the poor. This is a point that even a New Testament author is going to pick up with and run with it. Turn with me, please, to the book of James in the New Testament. We'll look at the final verse, actually. So the final verse of James chapter 1 is going to read this. Pure and undefiled religion in the sight of our God and Father is this, to visit orphans and widows in their distress, to keep oneself unstained by the world. Don't neglect the orphans. Don't neglect the widows. What is Zechariah saying hundreds of years earlier, verse 10? Do not oppress the widow or the orphan. Again, the stranger or the poor. Elsewhere, James is going to have something to say about that too. Oh, you see a rich man enter on in, you want to give him the prize seat and you make the other ones sit in the back, or whatever. You're showing favoritism to a wealthier class than you would a poorer class. And James is like, no, that's not how it should be. Zechariah is the same. Don't oppress these people, the stranger or the poor. Do not devise evil in your hearts against one another. But in verse 11 of Zechariah 7, they refused to pay attention, and they turned a stubborn shoulder. They stopped their ears from hearing. They made their hearts like flint, so they could not hear the law and the words which the Lord of hosts has sent by his Spirit through the former prophets. Therefore, great wrath came from the Lord of hosts. Great wrath. Now, when you think about that, in the reign of the last of the kings, Zedekiah, they actually decided, you know what, we're going to let all the slaves go free and we're going to do this. And then Jeremiah is like, whoa, you guys did something good. Well, then they turned around a couple of weeks later and re-enslaved everybody, right before the whole thing. And then God's like, all right. They rejected my law. They rejected this. They rejected the former prophets. Therefore, great wrath came from the Lord of hosts. If you turn back with me again to the book of Jeremiah, well, first of all, we'll kind of take a look at Jeremiah 4, verse 22. Jeremiah 4, verse 22. My people are foolish. They know me not. They are stupid children. By stupid here, it does not mean that, they've got like a mental defect or something like that. That the Hebrew word there means basically you pervert your own logic to justify what you know is wrong. They have no understanding. They are shrewd to do evil, but to do good they do not know. Elsewhere ahead in Jeremiah chapter 5, the final couple of verses there, an appalling and a horrible thing has happened into the land. The prophets prophesy falsely, the priests rule of their own authority, and my people love it so. But what will you do at the end? Things keep building, and they keep building. And then eventually what's going to happen later in Jeremiah is God's going to basically say to Jeremiah, don't even pray for these people anymore. And that's how scary it gets. To me, that's one of the scariest verses, in the Bible, if God himself is going to say of a person, don't even pray for him anymore. And then that's kind of how bad things got. In Zechariah's day, therefore, great wrath in verse 12 came from the Lord of hosts. I mean, they had all these prophets people reaching out to them, crying out. Well, they weren't listened to, but they were heard. They weren't listened to, but they were heard. Like it says in verse 13 of Zechariah 7. Just as he called and they would not listen, so they called and I would not listen, says the Lord of hosts. Okay, now the calamity's happening. 586 BC is closing in. Nebuchadnezzar, the siege is happening. Now it's time to get religious. Let's call on God. At least one of them. Maybe somebody will answer. Maybe somebody will save us. God's like, you know what? I sent a whole bunch of people to you and you wouldn't listen. Well, now I'm going to give you what your wish was. You're going to deal with the consequences of your own actions. Consequences of your own actions. So they called and I would not listen, said the Lord of hosts. But I scattered them with a storm wind among all the nations whom they have not known. Thus the land is desolated behind them, so that no one went back and forth, for they made the pleasant land desolate. So notice earlier, at the time of the former prophets in verse 7, Jerusalem's inhabited, it's prospered, along with the cities around it. The Negev and the foothills were inhabited. Now to verse 14, they're scattered. The land is in desolation. No one goes back and forth. They made the pleasant land desolate. Remember in Zechariah 2, one time God calls the land of Israel the Holy Land, here the pleasant land. The whole thing is made desolate. So he wants this to sink in with them for a bit. Okay, you came to me with a question about fasting. What's your motive? I mean, now God knows what the motive is, but he wants them to kind of see. Are you just asking this about a religious observance that you feel good about doing, or are you doing this onto me? Others did this. The former prophets warned about this. We saw it in Isaiah. Some of the stuff God wanted them to, we saw in Micah. Some of these things we knew. So, what do you want to do? The land is desolate behind them. No one goes back and forth, for they made the pleasant land desolate. And again, the land is desolate. I scattered them. Where does Sharezer and Regamelech come from in verse 2? From Bethel, but they obviously were part of the Babylonian captivity. They weren't native Hebrew-born Israelites from the land. They were elsewhere.